Hi, everybody. My name is Alberta Kong. I'm a professor and chief of the Division of Adolescent Medicine with the University of New Mexico Department of Pediatrics. I'm also a co-chair of the Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and I have the honor today to present to you Esther Churchwell, who is the board of directors with the New Mexico Japanese American Citizens League. She's going to be presenting Japanese heritage, culture, and history. I've learned so much from her during this time, and I hope you do too. There's a lot of history here in New Mexico, and I hope you enjoy her presentation. I give you Esther Churchwell.
Hello, my name is Esther Churchwell, and I'm with the New Mexico Japanese American Citizens League. I've been invited here today to speak about the Japanese heritage, culture, and history. I would like to start off by talking about our Japanese history and culture. I will only provide a brief overview of this since there are considerable differences between that in Japan and the westernized world outside of Japan, but the humbleness of our culture in both worlds is very similar. For example, I started this presentation with a bow. In Japan, bowing, or the art of bowing, is very significant in the Japanese culture, whether it is a simple nod to a store clerk or a deep bow to someone who's head of or superior or an important person. Also, in part of our custom, I'll be talking about is wearing shoes or outer footwear inside a home, hotel room, restaurant, or shrine is impolite in the Japanese culture. You may have visited some friends of Japanese ancestry who required you to take off your shoes. And the reason for this is so that you don't track any dirt or even germs from your shoes into the living area. Now, if you've been in some homes and they've had infants who are crawling on the floor, surely you don't want to have them crawling or touching any germs or dirt from your shoes. So if you see any shoes that are lined up in the entryway, that's an indication without the host telling you that you really should remove your shoes. Also, part of our custom is you will very seldom hear a Japanese person speak or laugh loud on a train, bus, or other public transportation in Japan, or even answer their cell phone, because it is impolite to be noisy or rude in public. Another custom is omiyagi, or gift giving, which is common in our culture when visiting someone or returning home from a trip. It is not respectable to visit someone empty-handed. The gift may not need to be expensive. It may include something as simple as sweets or light snack. Another custom that you will mainly see in Japan is here in the westernized society, slurping of one's food is poor table manners. But in Japan, it is a symbol of a compliment to the cook or to the host. The Japanese influence is popular in our Western society. You will notice that we have sushi, which is made of slices of raw fish wrapped in rice and seaweed. It's a common menu fare in various Asian eateries, even here in New Mexico. Aside from raw fish, vegetables and other fillings are also found inside or on top of the hand-formed rice pieces. You may also get a vegetarian sushi. Here in New Mexico, the chefs have a signature item with their sushi, and that of green chili. A complement to sushi is a hot sake drink, which is a rice wine, or hot green tea that complements the sushi. Also, food is generally served with miso soup, which is soybean soup, and in it there's little cubes of tofu or soybean curds and wakame or algae. Now, soy sauce is used by many to put over their sushi, and it's also widely used with any type of rice. Now, wasabi is on the bottom screen, is Japanese horseradish, which adds a spicy kick to any of your food. One of the more popular go-to food from Japan is ramen. It comes in a bowl or a cup, and it's usually popular, especially among children and teens, when waiting for a prepared meal takes too long to satisfy their hunger. All they do is add some hot water to it, and voila, a full meal in only minutes. A favorite nutritional snack or appetizer in most of the Asian restaurants is edamame, or soybeans in a pod, that are boiled or steamed with a pinch of salt. And all you do is pick those pods up and pop it into your mouth. Shelled edamame is also used in salads or other dishes. When you look around, the Japanese influence is almost everywhere, whether it is related to customs, food, or arts. The popular arts at festivals or other Japanese events may include taiko drumming, Japanese calligraphy, sumie, which is black ink painting, folk dancing, martial arts such as kendo, karate, or judo. And we also have musical instruments of the shamisen, which is a two-stringed instrument, and the koto, which is a form of Japanese harp that lays on the floor. We also have the exquisite art of ikebana, or flower arranging. There's also tea ceremony that is very formal, using green matcha tea. And a popular hobby here that I've seen in New Mexico is bonsai. It's miniature trees that are planted in containers. And we also have origami, the art of paper folding. You can make a lot of different items with these papers, Japanese papers. Japanese calligraphy, or shodo, which you will see there, along with the sumie, are very popular, and it takes skills of many, many years of training by various artists. Now, we are proud of the influence that our Japanese heritage and culture have had in many societies around the world. These photos were taken from a festival that the New Mexico Japanese American Citizens League has every year, but due to the pandemic, we are unable to hold in-person events. But we're hoping by next year, in September, Aki Matsuri means fall festival, and you will see a lot of these entertainment and arts presented there. And so keep watch of our publications. It's usually at the end of September of each year. Thank you. The next subject I will be talking about is not a very popular one. And this has to do with World War II, which is for our Japanese history. Racial sentiments, discrimination, and hate crimes towards the Japanese were overtly evident over 79 years ago when Pearl Harbor was bombed on December 7, 1941. Our government's incarceration of 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry during World War II was a shameful aberration of our country's constitutionality and American principles. The roundup of Japanese men began quietly and rapidly within 48 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was thought that they were on the government's watch list long before December 7, 1941, possibly because of their occupations and the education they received in Japan. They were separated for months from their families before they could communicate their incarceration whereabouts. Most of these men were community and religious leaders, and about 1,291 were arrested immediately. John DeWitt, the Army general in command of the West Coast, was reported as saying, "A Jap's a Jap. They are a dangerous element, whether loyal or not." And according to his statements, anyone with 1/16 Japanese American blood would be removed from the East Coast. Executive Order 90611 was subsequently signed by President Delano Roosevelt on February 19, 1942. Japanese community all over the nation celebrates February 19th as Day of Remembrance. And this executive order allowed the Secretary of War and military commanders to round up people of Japanese descent from the West Coast to protect the United States against possible espionage and sabotage. You will see on the map the darkened area from Washington, Oregon, California, and the southern part of Arizona as the exclusion zone where Japanese Americans were removed. People were forced to leave their houses, shops, farms, fishing boats, and told they could only take what you can carry. And for most, that was only one suitcase. They also had approximately a week to 2 weeks to settle any business affairs that they needed to take care of. They were not told where they were going, how long they would be gone, or why. For months, they stayed at what was called assembly centers. These are temporary quarters that the government set up immediately to house them, living in racetrack barns or on fairgrounds amid the stench of horses and other animals that were hastily removed to make room for the families in custody. They were then transported to 10 relocation centers, which were primitive, temporary camps built in remote landscapes in the interior West and Arkansas. They had to endure the cold, the heat, the wind, the blowing dust, and the isolation in desolate areas, all due to war hysteria, racial prejudice, and failure of political leadership. One of the pictures that always got to me was the picture of this dog that had to be left behind. This dog wanted to go with its owners. Approximately 62% of the internees, or about 70,000 men, women, and children, were forced to live behind barbed wire fences from 1942 to 1945. They were United States citizens. They were not aliens, they were not immigrants. They were born here in the United States. Children, as young as 6 months old, were removed from orphanages and Caucasian and Hispanic foster homes and sent to the Children's Village at Manzanar War Relocation Center, about 230 miles north of Los Angeles. While the United States Census Bureau denied providing confidential neighborhood information regarding Japanese Americans for decades, it was finally made public in 2007 that they did in fact occur when the roundup of those of Japanese ancestry began. How the Army commander justified that the infants and toddlers, as you will see in their cribs, were a threat to the national security of the United States is still unknown. You will notice from some of these photos, especially the top photo, where the land is very desolate. I mean, they were put in areas that no one would wanted to live, and it was far away from any of the towns. But these families worked and the land, and they were eventually able to grow their own food. And while they were incarcerated behind barbed wire, they did not just sit back like in a lot of prisons do. They were actually productive people. They gathered anything around their camps, outside of their camps, and they did beautiful artwork. They created all these various artifacts that are now located in the Smithsonian Museum or other museums around the country. Although families continued to be incarcerated in remote areas without ever being charged with any crime or even having a hearing, approximately 1,000 young adults volunteered from the camps to serve in the United States military and in the Military Intelligence Service, joining up with the segregated all-Japanese 100th Infantry Battalion and 442nd Regimental Combat Team. This unit was considered the most decorated infantry regiment in the history of the United States, with about 14,000 Nisei, or second generation, from Hawaii and mainland United States. They fought in the European theater during World War II and the Korean War. Several New Mexicans were part of the 442nd and 100th Battalion. And you will see that in the lower left-hand corner, one soldier is bidding his mother goodbye. And the center folder is the model for the segregated all-Japanese unit, and it was called Go for Broke. One of the soldiers from Gallup, New Mexico, Nishimura, received the nation's highest award, the Congressional Medal of Honor, following his gallantry and 2.5 years as a prisoner during the Korean War. He first served during World War II, but was later reactivated as a reservist during the Korean War. Nishimura is currently 95 years old and is still a resident of Gallup. In addition to our soldiers, approximately 400 Navajo code talkers from the Navajo Nation were an integral part of World War II alongside our Japanese American soldiers. Their Diné language, used in complex, unwritten, and unbreakable codes, was unfamiliar to the Japanese commanders during radio and phone communications, thereby giving our military forces an advantage over the enemies. Although World War II ended in August 1945, the last internment camp closed in March 1946. Japanese Americans were then met with waves of hostility as they tried to resume their former lives outside of barbed wire fences. Many found that their properties had been seized for non-payment of taxes or otherwise appropriated, and most of all, they were not welcome to return or relocate in many communities simply because of their ethnicity. You will see that from these photos, just a few of the disparaging remarks or signs that they came home to. It has been estimated that the collective economic loss to Japanese American internee families in the United States totaled in the billions because they were forced to leave behind their belongings, businesses, and land when they were forcibly removed and sent to internment camps. Several had lands in prime areas, such as in Silicon Valley, south of San Francisco Bay Area, and other locations that served as acres of successful agricultural business or storefronts in the center of towns. These families were not able to recoup their losses, and the toll on their psychological state, along with PTSD, was tremendous. However, most of them started all over again and persevered the trauma of incarceration to lead productive lives again. Now, a number of people have asked, why did the internees not protest the loss of their properties that had to be left behind? Following the unjust incarceration for years behind barbed wires, the general sentiment of the Japanese culture was one of humility, or shikata ga nai, meaning it cannot be helped. Nothing can be done about it. That's how they endured their years behind barbed wire fences. It was part of their culture. Another sentiment was gaman shite, which means endure the unbearable with patience and dignity. In other words, the situation leaves one with no alternative but to get over it. The Civil Liberties Act was passed in 1988, 48 years after these families were incarcerated, and Congress issued a formal apology to the internees. While approximately 80,000 of the surviving 120,000 internees received $20,000 in reparation after 1988, this amount was not near the collective loss that totaled in the billions. After Executive Order 9066 was signed, Canada followed suit and forcibly removed 21,000 of their Japanese residents from their west coast. Mexico also issued their version of the order and removed 2,264 people of Japanese descent from Peru, Brazil, Chile, and Argentina. Now, life behind the barbed wires it was a hardship for a number of them. And although there are some recorded deaths, the War Relocation Authority recorded 1,862 deaths all across 10 camps due to cancer, heart disease, tuberculosis, and vascular disease as the primary causes of death. But a number of the internees were also killed by guards, either for standing close to the perimeter defenses, or they were rioting due to overcrowdedness, lack of food, and lack of medical attention. Remember, these were in very desolate areas, so medical attention was not readily available to them. The Japanese experiences and history during World War II should never have happened, nor should it be repeated. As I said, 62% of these individuals were U.S. citizens, and their civil rights were impinged. But prejudice, racism, mistreatment, and hate crimes against our citizens and immigrant families are still prevalent in our communities. This slide shows the map of where the camps were located. There, as you see on the right side, there in California, there were 2 camps. Idaho, 1, Utah had 1. Arizona were 2, Wyoming, Heart Mountain, Colorado, Camp Granada, or Camp Mamachi. And the farthest was there in Arkansas. It was recently announced by the U.S. Postal Service that a Go for Broke stamp will be issued on June 3rd, 2021, and the stamp is noted for Go for Broke, Japanese American Soldiers of World War II Forever stamps. The stamp recognizes the contributions of the Japanese soldiers, about 33,000 altogether, who served in the U.S. Army during and immediately after World War II. The motto, Go for Broke, means go for your goal with your best effort and positive attitude, no matter how difficult the task. Now, there are a number of soldiers that are referred to as the Go for Broke soldiers, and that means the American men and women of Japanese heritage who served in the U.S. military during World War II. So we are very proud and honored to have the U.S. Postal Service issue this stamp. And it took years and years for widows and families to ask for stamps such as this, and it is finally happening. And right now, there's a National Go for Broke Day, which is celebrated on April 5th throughout the country. Now, the next section of my presentation will talk about the New Mexico internment camps. You did not see New Mexico on that map because it was not part of the original 10 War Relocation Authority camps. There was little known information about the internment camps in New Mexico until descendants of internees imprisoned in New Mexico began researching archives and questioning historians and government entities about the exact location of campsites in the state, when no documentation could be located. There are also a couple of grave sites with Japanese names identified in Santa Fe, and additional markers reported by families who returned to Clovis area for a visit in recent years. Excuse me a minute, I do need some water. The camps in New Mexico were built and run by the Department of Justice, Immigration and Naturalization Service, and the U.S. Army. They manage 4 different camps in Santa Fe, the Old Raton Baca area, and Fort Stanton and Camp Lordsburg. 3 of these camps only held men who were arrested by government. Is there a map?
For this one?
There. Okay. So this is the map that shows the 4 different camps. And Santa Fe, you will notice, is right in the center. I will talk a little bit more about those. Fort Stanton and Lordsburg are further down south. And Old Raton Ranch is in Lincoln County. Now, 3 of the camps only held men who were arrested by government agents as early as December 7, 1941. As I said, these may have been on the government's watch list for a long while, and they were mainly priests, those that were educated in Japan, or businessmen. So these religious leaders, businessmen, teachers, fishermen, farmers, and others whom the Department of Justice labeled as enemy aliens and thought to be a threat to the national security on the basis of treason, espionage, and sabotage. However, no such evidence was ever uncovered in any of the camps around the United States. The internees were not afforded any legal hearings nor convicted of any crime. prior to their years of imprisonment. As a former CCC, or Civilian Conservation Corps camp in Santa Fe, the U.S. Department of Justice, to the next screen, acquired that site in February 1942 and began incarcerating Issei, or first-generation Japanese immigrants, primarily from the West Coast and Hawaii. The average age of the men at this camp was 52 years, and although the internees had lived in the United States for at least 20 years, they were excluded from attaining U.S. citizenship at the time due to immigration laws until 1952. Between 1942 and 1946, 4,555 men passed through the Santa Fe camp. This camp was unique because it was not built in a desolate location. It was only 1.5 miles from downtown Santa Fe, and conditions at this camp were reported to be better than any other camps in New Mexico, including the relationships with the guards and other staff. The abandoned CCC camp already had 8 unused barracks and a mess hall on 80 acres. Another unique aspect of the Santa Fe camp was that it included Japanese internees from South America. You will notice this is a marker that was set up above the campsite. The current location of the camp is now the Casa Solano neighborhood. And this gentleman in this picture was the only survivor of the Santa Fe camp that was able to attend the dedication of this marker on April 20th, 2002. His name is Bill Nishimura, and at 82 years old, he was really humorous. When he mentioned that the camp starved the men, everyone was somewhat surprised because they had heard that the Santa Fe camp was a lot better than all the other camps here in New Mexico. Well, he clarified that, saying, "They starved us. We were only men. There were no women there for us." And at 82 years old, saying that, he had the audience in laughter. The Fort Stanton camp was known as the Segregation Camp No. 1, and it held dissident Japanese Americans from other camps around the nation who supported Japan, and some were subsequently sent to Japan. Approximately 50 of the male internees were housed with German seamen who were already there from a German cruise liner when the war with Germany began. The Lordsburg Camp, managed by the U.S. Army, housed 1,523 Japanese immigrant males from 1942 to 1945. This camp, if you noticed on the map, was on the bottom, was the farthest south, the Lordsburg Camp. There were a lot of problems with this camp, starting from mismanagement of camp affairs, labor disputes involving the assignment of work duties to the internees, and general unrest. There was a shooting of 2 elderly, disabled men for unsubstantiated attempts to escape while waiting to be transported from the train drop-off point to the campsite 3 miles outside of town. Neither could make the long march in the middle of the night due to their disabilities, and transportation was to be provided for them but never arrived. The guard who shot and killed them was quickly acquitted and promoted 2 weeks later. He was considered a hero and held in high regard by the townspeople. When German and Italian POWs were sent to this camp, the internees were moved to the Santa Fe camp or various immigration and naturalization service camps around the country. Historian Molly Pressler of the Hidalgo County Museum had researched the Lordsburg camp since 1976 and compiled a list of all the Japanese internees that passed through that camp. with dates of incarceration and other personal information. Years later, a member of our organization, whose father was interned at the Santa Fe camp, discovered that her father was also in Lordsburg Camp, while she and her mother were incarcerated in another state. Others have used this information to find out about their relatives who were in the Lordsburg Camp. Molly Pressler is still with the county museum and still shares her roster with anyone who questions her. The old Raton Ranch, or Baca Camp, which is 12 miles from Lincoln, New Mexico, and north of Fort Stanton, was the only camp in New Mexico that incarcerated entire families rather than only men. It held 10 railroad workers and their young families, which included 10 men, 5 women, and 17 Nisei, or second-generation children. Half of the men were single, widowed, or had wives in Japan. These families were whisked away in the middle of the night by federal agents with the assistance of the state police in January 1942, when hate-filled townsmen with guns and oil torches were heading towards their cluster of homes in the outskirts of Clovis. The families were forced to leave most of their belongings behind as they were being rescued from the angry mob and dumped in an odd concentration camp in the mountains of Lincoln County, over a 3-hour drive from Clovis. The families, however, were subsequently moved to another location because this initial site housed approximately 400 German POWs and a 17-year-old Japanese teenager, objective strongly citing that the Germans may kill or even molest the women and children in their group. INS officers in charge of the camp agreed and immediately relocated the Japanese family to the abandoned CCC facility called the Baca Ranch Camp. The families were eventually moved to war relocation authority camps in other states in November 1942 after spending 10 months in the Raton Ranch Baca compound. The same 17-year-old female tutored the younger children since they were not allowed to attend school in the neighboring town. The camps of New Mexico were eventually demolished or dwindled to disrepair over the years, with little evidence of structures remaining at the original sites. Their locations were discovered from interviews and research of people who were familiar with the camps, and markers have since been placed. As I said earlier, the Santa Fe Internment Camp is now the location of the Casa Solano neighborhood. Some of the residents of this housing tract have remarked that the soil is so fertile for planting on their property because the men interned at the camp during World War II toiled the land for their own gardens. After years of research, beginning in 2011, with sizable grants from the National Park Service, a collaborative effort between Colorado State University's Public Lands History Center, the New Mexico Japanese American Citizens League, internee camp survivors and their families, various scholars, and community members resulted in the publication of Confinement in the Land of Enchantment. Okay. This book details the internees and campsites along with comments by those who lived outside the camp enclosures. It also chronicles the controversy surrounding the final approval of erecting a marker above the Santa Fe campsite by the City Council in October 1999. A particular dissenter, who was a veteran of the war, mistook the internees that were in the camp as the same enemies who were responsible for the noted Bataan death march that our U.S. military servicemen endured in the Philippines, instead of identifying them as citizens of the United States. Honoring the internees with a camp marker divided families, friends, neighbors in heated debates for months. The tie-breaking vote that finally approved the Santa Fe marker was cast by the mayor at the time. In 2014, the town of Clovis, New Mexico, welcomed back the survivors of the railroad workers who were whisked out of town late in the night to avoid a lynch mob. Only 3 of the surviving children in their late 70s and early 80s at the time were able to make the trip with their own families. 2 of the survivors, a brother and sister, came from Oregon, and you will see them in this picture, standing by the Raton Ranch Vaca campground. The other survivor traveled from Ohio. It was a very emotional visit back to New Mexico after 72 years. The town of Clovis held its annual Pioneer Day Parade, with the 3 survivors serving as grand marshals at the head of the parade. New Mexico Japanese American Citizens League entered a float in that same parade and won first prize over all the other floats. Several events were held to welcome back the survivors, with families of their former schoolmates and church members coming out to greet and honor them with luncheons and other activities during their week-long visit. A huge billboard sign at a business also displayed a welcome home message. It is thought that the city of Clovis may be the only town in the United States to openly apologize and welcome former Japanese American internees back to the town that forcibly removed them from their homes during World War II. Attempts continue to be made to include the World War II experiences of the Japanese and Japanese Americans in New Mexico in our school curriculum and textbooks. Until then, presentations, such as what I am doing right now, is one of the ways of sharing the history and experiences within the internment camps with the community. Thank you very much for this invitation to allow me to speak to you about the Japanese culture and heritage and history in New Mexico. Arigatou gozaimasu. I am with the Japanese American Citizens League, the New Mexico, and as I mentioned in part of the arts slides where we had the various entertainment and arts listed, a number of those came from our annual Akimatsuri, or Fall Festival. Due to pandemic, we have not had one for 2019 and 2020, but we're hoping, or 2020 and 2021, but we're hoping in September of 2022, we will be able to have the in-person event all over again. And this is what our festival is called. It's called Akimatsuri, and it means Fall Festival. And we usually have it at the end of September. So if you would look for publications or announcements next year, we hope you will join us to learn and see our culture a little bit closer, up close, and enjoy even the foods that we will have.